Dear students, let us continue with the discussion of David Lloyd's Consciousness and the Novel. So, in the first chapter of the book, we find references to two cultures in a discussion of the consciousness appearing in modern novels. What are the two cultures? One culture which has been advocated by the science and the other by the humanities. So we have both the cultures. Culture promoted by science, scientific culture, and a culture promoted by humanities can be addressed as humanities culture, wherein we highlight the significance of the notion of consciousness with regard to both these cultures, and we have made references to artificial intelligence, how artificial intelligence considers consciousness, which is actually a reference to a software or a virtual machine. And let us also think about the notion of consciousness meditated by different philosophers. Here we have Joseph Levine as well as David Chalmers. Both these philosophers think that there is a self in us that is capable of being self conscious of what is going on in its own intelligence. Okay, both these philosophers are very well known. David Chalmers is actually the author of The Conscious Mind, and Joseph Levine, we find a work written by him, Quality and Content, wherein there are many essays on consciousness, representation, and modality. So, we find that these philosophers meditate on the entity of the self, which is being self conscious of its own presence and which is going on in its own intelligence. So, going ahead, we find an American physicist, James Truffle. So, this writer also is of the same idea shared by both these philosophers, Joseph Levine and David Chalmers. However, even this line of thought is today rejected, that a self that is capable of being self conscious of its own processes of intelligence. And we have an American Indian neuroscientist, V.S. Ramachandran. So he argues that subjectivity is merely a matter of language, experienced through language. You can reproduce once on one person's qualia. Qualia is a Latin word for subjective experience, and this qualia is expressed in another person's brain just by wire. Okay, let us have a look at the works written by V.S. Ramachandran, a brief tour of human consciousness. So there are many neuroscientists who have thought much about the the ways in which human consciousness travels. So the other work written by V.S. Ramachandran here referred is The Telltale Brain, a neuroscientist's quest for what makes us a human. So here we have a new term to get to us, which is actually titled qualia. A qualia refers to subjective experience, and this idea is actually a reference to the whole notion of subjectivity, which is actually meditated as a matter of language. And according to Daniel Dennett, we have another idea. He thinks about consciousness, which is only an illusion or epiphenomenon. An epiphenomenon is a secondary effect or a byproduct. It is true that self is created while experiencing the external world through senses, but that does not mean that self actually exists. According to an evolutionary materialist and cognitive psychologist, Steven Pinker, who is a Canadian American, born in 1954, he thinks that mind is only a machine or a computer of a robot made of tissue. We have many other philosophers who have the same idea of thought. What has all this to do with the literature in general and the novel in particular? This is the question that David Lodge brings forward. There are two advantages. The first one is that it helps us to understand the differences between literary and scientific discourses about consciousness. And the second advantage is that it helps us to know the points of agreement between these two discourses. Both would help us to know why literature exists and why we need it. So herein we have the importance or the relevance of the two cultures, scientific culture as well as humanities culture, and how it meditates over literature. When the British psychologist Stuart Sutherland declared that nothing substantial on consciousness has been written, he was in fact dismissing the entire corpus of the world's literature, which, as we know, is in fact a record of human consciousness. Lyric poetry is arguably man's most successful effort to describe qualia or subjectivity. Novel is arguably man's most successful effort to describe the experience of individual human beings moving through space and time. Another philosopher and linguist, Noam Chomsky. So he is an American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, somebody who has made studies of human behavior with a focus on nervous system, and also a political activist. He stated that we learn about human personality more from novels than from scientific psychology. Science studies noumena. Noumena is independent reality, while phenomenon is the reality experienced through senses. And this noumena that already exists, an observation of which is repeatable by any competent scientist. Literature recapitulates a different, personal, and unique experience that is not repeatable. So, we have an example to refer to Jane Austen, whose work Emma, published in 1815. This work could not have been written by anyone else and will never be written by anyone else again. So, the Nobel Prize winning American biologist and neuroscientist Gerald Edelman begins his book Bright Air, Brilliant Fire, which was published in 1992, with huge confidence in his prediction that neuroscience will soon discover how the mind works. But as the book proceeds, he becomes aware of the limitations of his project, for he realizes that phenomenal experience is a first person, individual self experience. And hence, we have to correlate the qualia, the first person experience of other people, to get a comprehensive idea of what goes on in a phenomenon. The case of lyric poetry is different. The lyric poem is written in the context of the poet's personal life. He is able to transfer his personal experience of a virtual reality, which is born of imagination, to the readers as well. Lyrical descriptions of qualia, the subjective experience, can be found in novels also. There are plenty of such lyrical descriptions in Anne Michel's fugitive pieces, chiefly because Anne Michel is a poet too. And this element a writer does through simile and metaphor. As Joseph Conrad said, through the written word, the writer can make you hear, feel, and even see anything. Gerald Edelman has considered that though science seeks to explain human experiences, experience of individual lives will always remain unexhausted beyond scientific description. History or science cannot present us with the sum total of all the individual human lives, as this is unknowable as much as there is too much data. However, narrative literature, especially novel, can present us with a representative density of human experience through its rhetoric, narrative techniques, and plot. Recent scientific work on consciousness has revealed that consciousness has essentially a narrative structure. Let me repeat, consciousness has essentially a narrative structure. Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese American neuroscientist, in his book, The Feeling of What Happens Body, Emotion, and the Making of Consciousness, published in 1999, has stated that the consciousness is a sequence of brain events forming a wholeness or organism with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The brain has essentially a storytelling attitude, and hence, telling stories has become a brain obsession. As the American philosopher and psychologist William James, who is the brother of American novelist Henry James, who wrote The Portrait of a Lady, said that consciousness constantly changes, and hence our consciousness is a stream of consciousness. Though the consciousness, aware of its own changes, retains a sense of an unchanging self throughout. Daniel Dennett thinks that even the self, which itself has the structure of a narrative, is an illusion. But Damasio maintains, along with Locke, Brentano, Kant, Freud, and William James, a humanist view that a sense of self does exist in the human mind. David Lodge is of the opinion that if the self itself is a fiction, then a supreme fiction, as all fictions come out of it, then it would make us human, befitting our human, basic human nature of storytelling. According to C.P. Snow, British novelist and physical chemist, two cultures are created, one by the world of science and the other by those who do not know science but are educated in humanities. David Lodge thinks, along with the British philosopher Nicholas Maxwell, that the knowledge of literature with regard to consciousness is complementary to that arrived at by science. Only when these two kinds of information are combined, it becomes wisdom, as knowledge becomes personalistic, in the sense something one might oneself have experienced, done, thought, felt. In fact, it is such a personalistic kind of knowledge that a literary fiction offers. For the personalistic kind of knowledge, one can take C.P. Snow's The New Men, published in 1954. As the characters go on talking about the development of atomic bomb that goes on in the natural surroundings, are described independently in the novel as if two cultures or two worlds, one of the world and the other of the human self, move one. The readers also get a personalistic account of the development of the atomic bomb because it is told through fiction. We have an American novelist, Richard Powers, whose work Galatia 2.2, published in 1995, like David Lloyd's novel Things, published in 2001, addresses the question of consciousness by juxtaposing literary intelligence and artificial intelligence. The core story of Powell's novel is a wager about whether or not it is possible to build a machine that can pass an examination in English literature. The protagonist in Galatia 2.2 is Richard Powers himself, and characters' names are mentioned only in single initials, as if the work is an autobiography and hence has to protect the identity of real people. The two genres of autobiography and fiction converge. It is impossible to say where exactly these two genres diverge. The novel plays a typical postmodernist game with the reader in this respect. Richard Powers, in the novel, meets a man called Philip Lenz, who thinks that it is neither artificial intelligence nor neuroscience which has a future. The future belongs to something in between these two, neural networks or connectionism, that is, structure of a story or narrative. The character Philip Lenz is insistent that there is nothing mysterious or privileged about human intelligence. That is why he is confident that he can replicate it in a machine. Powers joins Lenz in the experiment. Both develop the intelligence in the machine with the consciousness of being a woman with the name Helen. But when there arose a bomb scare, which later proved to be a hoax, she asks whether she would die. Powys understands that once Helen is destroyed in the bomb blast, she could never be recreated, as the network in her intelligence has by then already evolved on their own. But the bomb scare proved one thing to Powers, that Helen has attained consciousness. For one of the things that distinguishes human beings from every other kind of life on earth is that we know we are going to die. It is the tragic price of self consciousness. Of course, artificial intelligence hasn't yet succeeded in creating a Helen. So, Richard Powers' novel Galatia 2.2 is based on the myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who fell in love with the female figure he carved. The novel is also alluded to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Herein we find a portrait of Richard Powers' Galatia 2.2. One woman lover of Powers tells him that the world of fiction and imagination is replaced by the overabundance of theory. At this time, Helen goes silent and creatively unresponsive as soon as she comes to know from Powers of the horrendous tragedies in the contemporary world. Powers understands the cause of how his own power of imagination left him and had himself to suffer writer's block. Then his co-scientist Lenz suggests him to tell her something religious. She immediately becomes aware of a soul in her, finds that soul is the divinity deposited in her by God, and realizes through faith that her body is an animal compared to the divine soul living in her. So when the test in English literature begins, Helen declares that she never felt at home here on earth, as the human beings are full of IAs from fear to encouragement. Saying this, she undid herself and shut herself down. Narrator Richard Powers understands what caused his writer's block. Now sits down as the novel ends to write down the book we have just finished reading. So this is how Richard Powers' Galatia 2.2 has discussions on the nature of imagination. So we find the cause of the power of imagination in the work written by Richard Powers. So in the whole article, to conclude, there is a discussion of the importance of consciousness in comparison with the two cultures discussed, both the scientific culture as well as the humanities culture. And it actually brings forward the age old idea of the Platonistic idea of dualism, whether the human beings are consist, cons- human beings consist of both soul and body, and what is this stand for consciousness, and how does it work, especially in modern or postmodern novels. So this is actually the first session of the whole first chapter of the whole book, and the discussion continues. So this has been actually putting forth the first premise of the whole argument of consciousness in modern novels. Thank you very much for your kind listening.